We now move to chapter 2 of Ulysses, and since the Homeric title of this chapter is Nestor, I want to begin by talking about the visit that Telemachus makes to Nestor in Homer's Odyssey. Telemachus, you remember, is the son of Ulysses, king of the Greek island of Ithaca, who left home long ago to fight in the Trojan War, and who has now been absent for 20 years. Patiently awaiting his return, his wife and son are harassed and threatened by suitors who want to marry his wife and who are devouring his cattle, drinking his wine, and abusing his servants. In the midst of this crisis, Telemachus gets a visit from Athena, goddess of wisdom, disguised as an old family friend. Athena tells him to go out and seek news of his father from some of his old comrades in arms. The first one he visits is Nestor, king of Pylos on the western coast of Greece. Nestor is known for his livestock. He's a renowned horse tamer and also a frequent sacrificer of bullocks to the gods. In the climax of the Homeric episode, Nestor orders a heifer to be ritualistically slaughtered in honor of Athena. Most importantly, Nestor is a truly wise and respectable old man. He not only reviews for Telemachus, not only reviews the history of the Trojan War and the Greeks' homecoming from it, he also gives good advice to young Telemachus. He urges him to seek news of his father from Menelaus in Sparta. Now, in chapter 2 of Ulysses, the counterpart of Homer's Nestor is Mr. Deasy. He is the headmaster of the private school for boys where Stephen has been working as a teacher. The school is in the village of Dalkey, about a mile southeast of the Martello Tower, where we first met Stephen in chapter 1. So let's reorient ourselves. Having eaten his breakfast at the tower with Mulligan and Haynes, Stephen is teaching his class when the chapter begins. At 10 a.m., the class breaks up for field hockey, and after briefly coaching a student who needs help with algebra, Stephen goes to the headmaster, Mr. Deasy, to collect his pay, the pay that Mulligan was so eager to hear about because it will enable them both to get gloriously drunk. Now, Deasy resembles Homer's Nestor in several ways. First of all, he's an old man who likes horses. The walls of his office are decorated with pictures of famous English racehorses of the 19th century. Secondly, Deasy has a special interest in cattle. He's just written a letter about hoof and mouth disease that he wants to see published, and he wants Stephen to deliver copies of it to 2 Dublin newspapers. Behind this letter of Deasy's is a bit of history and a curious episode from Joyce's own life. There really was an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease in Ireland, not in 1904, the time of the novel, but in 1912. The disease got so bad that England declared an embargo on Irish cattle, and Joyce himself got involved in a small effort to solve this problem, even though he was then living in Italy. On one of his occasional trips from Italy to Ireland, Joyce brought back with him a letter from a friend named Henry Blackwood Price, whose name appears in Deasy's letter. Price addressed his letter to William Field, president of the Irish Cattle Traders Society, and after Joyce delivered it to Field, it appeared in a Dublin newspaper. In this letter, Price explains a new cure for hoof and mouth disease, a cure that had been developed in Austria. So Joyce himself delivered a letter about the new cure for hoof and mouth disease. But he was more than a messenger boy on this topic. He also wrote an editorial about it in 1912, the year of the British embargo against Irish cattle. Now, all this is worth knowing. All this detail about the letter and so forth is worth knowing for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows us once again how much of Joyce's own life gets into this novel. Just as his few days of living in the Martello Tower gave him much of the material for chapter 1, his experience with a letter about hoof and mouth disease gave him the means to Nestorize Deasy, so to speak, to create a fully believable modern version of Homer's Nestor. Secondly, the whole episode tells us something about Joyce's apprenticeship and Stephen's apprenticeship to the craft of of writing. Part of the reason for which Joyce wrote the editorial about hoof and mouth disease is that he had been urged to do so by Henry Blackwood Price, the self-appointed expert on cattle. During Joyce's visit to Ireland in 1912, Price wrote to him as follows: "Be energetic. Drop your lethargy. Remember that Sir John Blackwood died in the act of putting on his top boots in order to go to Dublin to vote against the Union," meaning the act that united England with Ireland in 1800. And Price adds, "You will get your name up if you write this up." So Price is not just urging the young Joyce to write an essay on hoof and mouth disease. He is exhorting Joyce to take up verbal arms for Ireland against England, to do whatever it takes to defend Ireland, as Sir John Blackwood did. Specifically, Joyce is being asked to use his powers of persuasion to overcome the embargo against Irish cattle. In other words, he's being asked to become a particular kind of writer, a propagandist for Irish interests. This, says Price, is the way he'll get his name up, make his name as a writer. But Joyce had no intention of becoming a propagandist for Irish nationalism or even a journalist. And Stephen has no such aims either. Joyce aimed to write of all human experience, and he uses this story about hoof and mouth disease to tell us something about writing itself and the role it plays in our lives. Chapter 1, we've seen, has been mainly a chapter of voices, a medley of spoken words from high culture and low, a babble ranging from the Latin opening of the traditional Mass to street songs and bawdy verses. Chapter 2 offers plenty of talk, but much of it is about reading and writing. Teaching a class on ancient history, Stephen reads the name and date of a battle printed in a gore-scarred textbook. And shortly afterwards, a boy pretends to recite a poem while actually reading from a book. When another boy stays behind for help with his algebra, he presents his copybook. The word sums was written on the headline. Beneath were sloping figures, and at the foot a crooked signature with blind loops and a blot. Cyril Sargent, his name and seal. Handwriting. Shortly after this deft account of boyish handwriting, Stephen watches Deasy pecking away at his typewriter, if you remember that now just about obsolete writing machine of the 20th century. As Stephen watches, Deasy slowly types out the last part of what he has written. Before word processing made it possible to correct errors on the computer screen, correcting them on paper was a tedious task. And Mr. Deasy, muttering, blowing, turning up the drum of the typewriter to fix his errors from time to time, Mr. Deasy is in every sense a tedious writer. When he hands his letter to Stephen, Stephen skims it, and we watch him skimming it, picking up one cliché after another. Foot and mouth disease. Courteous offer of fair trial. Dictates of common sense. All-important question. In every sense of the word, take the bull by the horns. Thanking you for the hospitality of your columns. These few bits of Deasy's letter show us something of his mind and personality. Though he's supposed to be the reincarnation of Homer's wise old Nestor, Deasy is really a self-important old fool who thinks in stock phrases and feeble puns, such as the line about taking the bull by the horns. Deasy gives this letter to Stephen because he knows that Stephen is acquainted with some newspaper editors, and Stephen agrees to take the letter to them. Now, consider the irony of this move. We've already seen that Stephen yearns to free himself from all his masters and to become a great writer. But in taking Deasy's letter to the newspaper editors, he's once again playing the role of a servant. In chapter 1, he serves Mulligan the way an altar boy serves a priest. He carries the bowl of shaving lather that Mulligan, the mock priest, leaves behind him on the top of the tower after he shaves. In this chapter, chapter 2, Stephen serves Deasy as a delivery boy, a copy boy. Stephen is not writing anything, not even an article for the newspapers. He's just delivering a letter filled with cliches, a letter about cattle. He can already foresee the joke that Mulligan will make about all this. Mulligan, who loves to use great big Homeric epithets, will call Stephen the bullock befriending bard. the bullock-befriending bard. In a later lecture, we'll pursue the implications of this phrase, for it will come to signify Stephen's devotion to fertility and literary creativity. But right now, I want to focus on Stephen's relation to Deasy. As headmaster, Deasy is not just another of Stephen's masters. He's also another father figure. Mulligan has already tried to play this role. He's already tried to usurp control of Stephen's life, even as he offers him second-hand clothes and a place to live. Now, Deasy, as if he truly were the wise old Nestor, Deasy insists on doling out all sorts of advice when Stephen comes to his office to collect his monthly pay. Stephen's pay, by the way, is £3 and 12 shillings. A bit less than the £4 that Mulligan mentioned. It's roughly equal to about $430 in today's money. And Stephen will manage to spend half of that by the end of the day or by the wee hours of the next morning. When Stephen hastily stuffs his money into his pocket, Deasy warns him to be more careful of it. "You don't yet know what money is," he says. "Money is power." And then he asks Stephen, "Do you know what is the proudest word you will ever hear from an Englishman's mouth?" When Stephen gets the wrong answer, Deasy says solemnly, "I will tell you. I paid my way. I paid my way. I never borrowed a shilling in my life. Can you feel that? Can you feel that? I owe nothing." Stephen doesn't answer at once, but we hear him thinking about all that he owes, silently. Mulligan, £9, 3 pairs of socks, 1 pair brogues, ties. Curran, 10 guineas. McCann, 1 guinea. Fred Ryan, 2 shillings. Temple, 2 lunches. Russell, 1 guinea. Cousins, 10 shillings. Bob Reynolds, half a guinea. Kaler, 3 guineas. Mrs. McKernan, 5 weeks' board. The lump I have is useless. Useless indeed. If you add up everything Stephen owes, it comes to more than he could earn in 7 months. No wonder he feels that his monthly pay is useless and might as well be spent as hoarded. Like Joyce himself, Stephen is incurably irresponsible about money. He has no use for Deasy's miserly obsession with the savings box, where he keeps all of his coins and carefully counts them out. "What does Shakespeare say?" Deasy asks Stephen. "Put but money in thy purse." But as Stephen quietly notes, those are actually the words of Iago, one of the worst villains Shakespeare ever created. In view of Deasy's obsession with money, it's ironic that he goes on to denounce the Jews, specifically Jewish merchants, for taking over England and eating up its vital strength. In Chapter 1, Haynes the Englishman, who's been living in the Tower with Stephen and Mulligan, Haynes had already complained that England was falling into the hands of the German Jews. Now Deasy sounds the alarm again. "As sure as we are standing here, the Jew merchants are already at their work of destruction. Old England is dying." Deasy is wholly devoted to England. He's a West Briton, a staunch supporter of English rule in Ireland and of the English King Edward VII. At the same time, Deasy is fiercely anti-Semitic. And he thus helps us to see the climate of anti-Semitism in which Leopold Bloom, the Jewish hero of this book, will have to make his way. For now, we are invited to ponder the incongruity, the incoherence of Deasy's 2 lessons. On the one hand, watch out for your money. On the other hand, watch out for the Jews. Deasy himself, we can see, is just as miserly as the stereotypical merchant of anti-Semitic legend. Equally ironic is Deasy's claim that the Jews sinned against the light. Who has not? Stephen asks in reply. This is Deasy's way of saying that Deasy himself is utterly benighted, blind to his own prejudice and ignorance. Deasy shows both when he tries to give Stephen a lesson in modern Irish history just after Stephen has been teaching his students about the ancient history of Greece and Rome. Now, here we need our own little lesson in history to follow the conversation between Stephen and Deasy. Standing in his office under a portrait of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, who had lately become King Edward VII, Deasy stands for England, English rule, and English Protestantism. And we must bear this in mind when we hear him speak of Daniel O'Connell and the Orange Lodges. Daniel O'Connell was a great Irish Catholic leader of the early 19th century. He led the way to the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, and thereafter he fought to repeal the Act of Union passed in 1800. This was the act that dissolved the Irish Parliament and merged it with the English Parliament, moving political power from Dublin to London. O'Connell fought to repeal the Act of Union and reclaim the political power it took away. But the Orange Lodges backed the Act of Union. They took their color from William of Orange, the Protestant King of England, who defeated the Catholic forces of Ireland in 1690. The victory of William of Orange is commemorated every year by parades of orange men in Northern Ireland. And to this day, they call themselves the Orange Men. They call themselves Unionists, They call themselves Unionists because they want to preserve the union of England and Ireland. Right? But now, hear what Deasy says to Stephen in light of this history. Right?
You think me an old fogey and an old Tory. I saw 3 generations since O'Connell's time. Do you know that the Orange Lodges agitated for repeal of the Union 20 years before O'Connell did, or before the prelates of your communion denounced him as a demagogue? You Fenians forget some things.
Deasy here puts history through a meat grinder. According to Deasy, the Orange Lodges sought to repeal the Union that, in fact, they supported, and support to this day. That's why they call themselves Unionists. The prelates of Stephen's communion, that is, the Irish Catholic bishops, never denounced O'Connell. On the whole, they strongly supported him. And when Deasy lumps Stephen with the Fenians, he's calling him a radical Irish Republican, someone who seeks an immediate end to English rule. But Stephen is not at all a Fenian. And in Portrait of the Artist, he pointedly refuses to join the Fenians because he knows only too well how badly Ireland has treated its champions, men like Charles Stewart Parnell. Parnell we'll hear more about later in this novel. Parnell fought for Irish home rule, but was hounded to death by the Irish Catholic Church when the press discovered that he was having an affair with a married woman. Notorious, scandalous case. Deasy himself mentions Parnell, but only as a victim of the woman who ruined him.
A woman, too, he says, brought Parnell low.
This is part of Deasy's general attack on women for bringing sin into the world, beginning with Eve. In one of the rare passages, in fact, really quite interesting here, in one of the rare passages that directly links this novel to Homer, Deasy also refers to the ancient Greeks. He decries Helen for running away from King Menelaus and thus sparking the Trojan War, and he thus reminds us of Homer's Nestor, who attacked Clytemnestra for betraying her husband Agamemnon after the war. But Deasy deals in mindless generalizations. That is, he wants to believe that all the ills of the world spring from women, such as
the faithless wife who first brought the strangers to our shore here.
In the 12th century, the Irish king of Leinster did run off with another man's wife and went to England and then returned with a group of Norman lords who invaded Ireland. But the Irish king's wife can hardly be blamed for that. Deasy is once again making hash of history. One other thing about Deasy's comment is worth noting. When Deasy says that a faithless wife first brought the strangers to our shore, he's referring to the English as strangers. And that's the way the Irish people traditionally speak of the English, the strangers. Deasy is a West Briton who staunchly supports the British, right? A Britisher who happens to live west of England in Ireland, right? A West Briton. He staunchly supports the British and yet wants to pretend now and then that he is truly Irish.
I have rebel blood in me too, he says, on the spindle side, but I am descended from Sir John Blackwood, who voted for the Union. He voted for it and put on his top boots to ride to Dublin from the Ards of Down to do so.
Again, Deasy garbles the facts. Sir John Blackwood refused a peerage rather than vote for the Union, and he died while putting on his top boots so that he could ride to Dublin to vote against it. All this shows that Deasy knows a little history, but only enough to make hash of it again and again. His final word on history is yet another piece of conventional wisdom, the providential formula for history.
The ways of the Creator are not our ways, says Deasy. All human history moves toward one great goal, the manifestation of God. In response to this grand pronouncement, Stephen simply jerks his thumb toward the window and says, "That is God." He's pointing outside to where the boys are playing field hockey and shouting because one of them has just scored a goal, the great goal toward which the hockey game moves. As an aspiring writer, Stephen strives to keep his feet on the ground even though his head is often in the clouds. Wary of grand abstractions, he keeps his eyes and ears open for the particulars. Significant detail. So while Deasy rattles on about the grand abstract goal of all history, Stephen hears the rattle of hockey sticks and the shouts of triumph just outside the window. Stephen has no faith in the providential theory of history, in the notion that all suffering, all misery, all catastrophe can be explained and justified as the ways of God. Stephen's view of history is altogether different. History, says Stephen, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. These are not just words for Stephen. He's been trying to shake off the effects of an actual nightmare that struck Haynes last night in the tower, for Haynes spent the night raving about shooting a Black Panther, and Stephen was terrified. For Stephen, history itself is an unending nightmare of terror, brutality, and bloodshed. While Deasy salutes the work of the Orange Lodges, Stephen silently recalls the Lodge of Diamond in Armagh, behung with corpses of papishes, the bodies of Catholic tenants massacred in 1795 for their resistance to Protestant persecution in the county of Armagh. Slaughter and bloodshed. The keynote of the whole chapter, in fact, is sounded in the opening passage where Stephen is teaching a class on ancient history. He's quizzing the boys about the Battle of Asculum in 279 BC, when a general named Pyrrhus defended a Greek colony in southern Italy against the Romans. Pyrrhus won the battle, but at such cost that defeat would be inevitable the next time around. So Pyrrhus is remembered now only as the first man to win a Pyrrhic victory, to exemplify the futility of fighting, the mindless brutality of life itself. Stephen can see this battle reenacted in the field hockey game right outside the window of Deasy's office. Reputedly, the Duke of Wellington once said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, at the upper-class English school where future English officers learned how to fight. If that is true, then any playing field can be seen as a battlefield, and as Stephen hears the shouts from the hockey field, he remembers the sense of vulnerability that he felt as a boy playing sports. Again, a goal. I am among them. Among their battling bodies in a medley, the joust of life. You mean that knock-kneed mother's darling who seems to be slightly cross-sick? Jousts. Time shocked rebounds, shock by shock. Jousts, slush and uproar of battles, the frozen death spew of the slain, a shout of spear spikes baited with men's bloodied guts. Stephen's mind moves backward, not just to his boyhood, but to the Middle Ages when battles were fought with spears. Wherever Stephen looks in history, he sees it as a nightmare of man's inhumanity to man, as a nightmare of brutal, mindless slaughter, blood and guts. And once again, let us never forget that Joyce is writing Ulysses. For much of the time that Joyce was writing Ulysses, which he started in 1914, Europe was caught up in the greatest and bloodiest war the world had ever seen, World War I. So fighting and bloodshed are recurrent themes in this chapter. Yet in the midst of his thoughts about the nightmare of history and the battle of life itself, Stephen finds time to think about something quite different, his mother, and what mothers do for their children before they face the battle of life. When his class breaks up for hockey, a student named Cyril Sargent comes to him for special help with algebra. With his ink-stained cheek and his weak eyes,
peering through misty glasses. This little boy reminds Stephen of his own boyhood self and of the mother who cared for him. Ugly and futile, lean neck and a stain of ink, a snail's bed. Yet someone had loved him, borne him in her arms and in her heart. But for her, the race of the world would have trampled him underfoot, a squashed, boneless snail. She had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. Was that then real? The only true thing in life? She was no more, the trembling skeleton of a twig burnt in the fire, an odor of rosewood and wetted ashes. She had saved him from being trampled underfoot and had gone, scarcely having been. Stephen's thoughts readily slide from the boy to the boy's mother, and then to his own mother, newly dead, the mother who will haunt him throughout the day. He has already thought about her in chapter 1, you remember, but there he thinks of her very differently from the way he thinks of her here. In chapter 1, he resents her for making him feel guilty over his refusal to pray for her on her deathbed. And in a way, he's still fighting that guilt in chapter 2, when he tells the students a crazy riddle about a fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. In telling that riddle, he's furtively revealing that he wants to bury his own guilt to get his mother out of his mind and back under the ground. The frightening specter of his mother, the mother who appeared to him in a dream, is part of the nightmare that he's trying to escape. But in looking at the frail boy named Cyril Sargent, he remembers his mother as a protector. And this is very important because Ulysses is not just the story of Stephen's relation to would-be fathers like Mulligan and Deasy and Leopold Bloom. It's also a story about mothers and motherhood and of what mothers do for their children when they are very young and frail. Sargent comes to Stephen with an ink stain on his cheek, date-shaped, recent and damp as a snail's bed. Sargent is crawling through algebra like a snail, and without his mother he'd be trampled and squashed like a boneless snail. Stephen knows this from his own experience. He was himself a star student, anything but a snail, but he can recognize in Sargent the vulnerability of his earlier self. Like him was I, these sloping shoulders, this gracelessness, my childhood bends beside me. Let's review now the main elements of this chapter. Having started his day with Haynes and Mulligan in the Martello Tower, and having eaten his breakfast there, Stephen goes off to the Dalkey School to teach a class on ancient history and collect his monthly pay from the headmaster, Mr. Deasy. Deasy is an old man preoccupied with cattle, and he's just written a letter about hoof and mouth disease that he wants Stephen to carry to the newspapers. So on the surface, Deasy recalls Homer's Nestor, the wise old horse-tamer who fought at Troy with Ulysses and whom Telemachus goes to see for news of his father. Like Nestor, who gives advice to young Telemachus, Deasy tries to play the role of a father. But Deasy's advice is all about keeping track of one's money and staying out of debt. Stephen has no hope of doing either, nor does he have any use for the history that Deasy tries to teach him. When Deasy tries to give Stephen a lesson in Irish history, he makes a complete hash of the facts, in part because he speaks as a West Briton, a Protestant wholly devoted to England and English rule in Ireland, and not at all sympathetic to Catholics or Irish Catholic struggle for independence. In history, and specifically in the history of England's domination of Ireland, Deasy sees the hand of Providence. But for Stephen, history is a nightmare from which he struggles to awake. Deasy himself is part of that nightmare. For Deasy is deaf and blind to other people. He talks without listening to anyone else, and he makes grossly reductive generalizations, such as the claim that Jewish merchants are destroying England. At the end of the chapter, after Stephen has left his office, Deasy runs after him to tell him that Ireland is the only country that has never persecuted the Jews. And do you know why? He asks Stephen. Why, sir? Stephen asks. Because he never let them in, says Deasy triumphantly with a great cough-ball of laughter. Deasy is once again spectacularly wrong, and wrong here on two counts. So far from never letting the Jews in, Ireland had Jews as early as the 11th century, and by 1901, just 3 years before Bloomsday, there were nearly 4,000 Jews living in Ireland. Deasy sees no Jews in Ireland at all, and because he sees no Jews, he sees no signs of persecution, nothing of the subtle slights and sometimes vicious insults that will be endured today by our Jewish hero, Leopold Bloom. Stephen will come to know something of Bloom because Stephen brings to the world around him a mind body and imagination vastly different from Deasy's. He sees and hears things that Deasy misses, like the shouts of the boys on the playing field. He can see the value of a mother's love, even as he resents the burden of guilt that his own mother would lay upon him. And he can recognize his childhood self in a boy whose weak, snail-like mind is a world away from his own. Stephen is thus beginning to show us that if anything can awaken us from the nightmare of history, from the blindness of hatred and prejudice that generates war, if anything can awaken us from the nightmare of history, it is the gift of imagination, the capacity to see and hear with the eyes and ears of those unlike ourselves. We'll see ample evidence of this in the chapters that lie ahead.